177 years ago, in the foggy confines of Wilkinson County, Mississippi, a transaction that should have been forgotten in auction records became the beginning of one of the most disturbing secrets in American slavery history. Margaret Whitmore, an obese widowed plantation lady, bought for only $12 a 7-year-old albino boy that no other buyer wanted to touch. The child, registered only as Thomas Defective, carried a condition that made him invisible in the eyes of traders. His skin, pale as paper and hair white as snow, made him an outcast even among the enslaved. What began as an apparent act of mercy transformed into something the local community tried to bury for over 170 years. A wedding photograph dated 1861, discovered in 2019 inside a family Bible kept in the attic of an abandoned church, revealed a truth that made historians question everything they knew about that plantation. In the faded image, Margaret Whitmore, then 52 years old, appears beside Thomas, now 20, in formal matrimonial attire. But it wasn't just the age difference that shocked. It was what the hidden parish records revealed about the 13 years between the purchase and that wedding. County court documents, sealed for more than a century and a half, mentioned domestic irregularities and questionable moral situation at Whitmore Plantation. Witnesses from that time, whose testimonies were suppressed, spoke of forced seclusion, of a boy who grew up isolated from the slave quarters, living inside the big house under circumstances no one dared question publicly. The wedding photograph wasn't just a portrait. It was physical evidence of a system that allowed plantation ladies to exercise absolute power over bodies that the law considered property, not people. The story of Thomas and Margaret Whitmore remained buried not only in official archives, but in the collective memory of a community that chose silence. Descendants of enslaved people from the region carried for generations whispered rumors about the ghost boy of the big house and the forbidden marriage that should never have happened. Only now, with the discovery of personal letters written by Thomas decades after the Civil War, does the truth begin to emerge from the shadows. A truth about control, isolation, and the weight of a secret that destroyed lives and erased identities. This is the account of how a child marked by difference became a prisoner of an obsession, and how the institution of slavery allowed crimes to happen inside big houses without anyone being able to intervene. It's the story of a silence that lasted generations, and of a photograph that finally forced the world to look at what it preferred to ignore. Chapter 1. The Boy Nobody Wanted. 177 years ago, on a suffocating July morning in Natchez, Mississippi, a slave auction at the municipal market became the stage for a transaction that local traders would try to forget. Among the bodies displayed on the wooden platform, chained and numbered, there was a 7-year-old child who made buyers look away. Thomas had no registered surname, only the word defective marked next to his number in the sale catalog. His skin was pale as candle wax, his hair white as raw cotton, and his red eyes gleamed under the relentless Mississippi sun. The auctioneer reduced the price 3 times before anyone dared raise their hand. Margaret Whitmore watched from the back of the crowd, her voluminous figure standing out among the farmers and traders who dominated the market. Widowed for 2 years, she managed alone a modest 200-acre plantation on the banks of the Buffalo River, a property inherited from a husband who left her childless and with a reputation for severity. No one expected her to make a bid. Women rarely participated directly in auctions, preferring to send overseers or administrators. But when Thomas's price dropped to $12, less than the value of a farming tool, Margaret raised her fan and made the only bid. The silence that followed was more disturbing than any scream. Traders exchanged disconcerted looks. The auctioneer hesitated before striking the gavel, as if expecting her to reconsider. But Margaret remained firm, her eyes fixed on the boy trembling on the platform. "That one ain't good for heavy work, ma'am," a nearby farmer muttered. "His skin can't take the sun. He'll die in a week in the field." Margaret didn't respond. She paid in cash, took the property papers, and ordered Thomas to follow her to the carriage. Before we continue, subscribe and activate the bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. The journey from Natchez to Whitmore Plantation took 3 hours along rough dirt roads. During the entire trip, Margaret didn't address a single word to the boy sitting on the carriage floor, his wide eyes observing the passing landscape. Other enslaved people from the property, who had come to town to load supplies, whispered among themselves in low voices. No one understood why the mistress had bought a visibly fragile child when the plantation needed strong workers for the approaching cotton harvest. When they arrived at the property at dusk, Margaret gave instructions that left the overseer, Samuel Briggs, visibly confused. Thomas would not be taken to the slave quarters with the others. He would not receive the coarse work clothes distributed to children. Instead, he would be housed in a small room at the back of the big house, a space that previously served as a pantry. "This boy won't work in the field," Margaret declared, with a firmness that admitted no questioning. "He will remain under my direct supervision." Samuel Briggs knew Margaret Whitmore long enough to know that contradicting her would be useless. He had worked for her late husband and remained on the property after the master's death, mainly because other overseers refused to work under a woman's orders. But this decision seemed different. "With all respect, ma'am, the other properties will comment. They'll find it strange that you keep a boy in the big house while you have so many needing supervision in the quarters." Margaret turned slowly, her round face hardening. "What other properties think is not my business, Mr. Briggs, and it shouldn't be yours either. This boy is my property, bought with my money, and I'll do with him as I see fit." Night fell over Whitmore Plantation with a dense silence. In the slave quarters, the enslaved whispered about the albino boy who had been taken into the big house. Some of the older women, who had seen generations of children pass through that property, felt a tightness in their chest they couldn't explain. Sarah, a 40-year-old woman who worked in the big house kitchen, was the only one who had the courage to ask the next day, "Miss Margaret, the boy will need food. May I prepare a tray for him?" Margaret was sitting on the covered porch, fanning herself against the heat. "I'll take care of that myself, Sarah. You don't need to worry about the boy." In the following days, Thomas was seen only briefly, always accompanied by Margaret, never alone. She took him to walk through the property gardens in the early morning hours, before the sun became too strong for his sensitive skin. She ordered clothes to be sewn especially for him, not the rough linen clothes worn by the enslaved, but finer fabrics, almost suitable for a free child. Samuel Briggs reported in a letter to a cousin that the mistress Whitmore seems to have developed a peculiar fixation with the defective boy, but the letter was never sent. He burned it the same night he wrote it. Thomas's isolation was almost complete. He didn't play with other enslaved children, didn't learn the trades that boys his age usually began to master. When Sarah occasionally saw him through windows, the boy always seemed to be sitting in a chair near Margaret, listening to her speak, watching her embroider or read. There were no visible signs of physical violence, no marks, no apparent injuries, but there was something in the way Thomas never smiled, how his red eyes always seemed frightened, that left Sarah deeply disturbed. In September of that year, when a visiting trader from the Vicksburg region stopped at Whitmore Plantation to negotiate cotton, he casually mentioned having seen a boy pale as a ghost in the gardens. Margaret responded with cutting coldness, "That boy is part of my household, and is not a matter for discussion." The trader never returned. In the plantation records for that year, Thomas appears listed simply as domestic property, depreciated value, a classification that separated him from the other enslaved and placed him in an undefined category, almost like a household object, not a person with productive function. Months passed and Thomas's presence in the big house became an accepted reality, though not understood. No one asked direct questions. No one questioned why Margaret Whitmore, a woman known for her practicality and coldness in business, had developed that singular obsession with a boy who had no economic value. Silence settled like a thick fog over the property, a silence that would last decades, burying truths that would only be discovered when that wedding photograph emerged from the shadows of history. Chapter 2. Growing up in the big house. Between 1848 and 1855, Thomas went from a fragile 7-year-old child to a 14-year-old teenager, but his world never expanded beyond the walls of Whitmore Plantation's big house. Court records from Wilkinson County, discovered in 2017 during a restoration project at the old courthouse, contain fragmentary testimonies from neighbors who expressed concern about the unusual domestic arrangement at the Whitmore property. A letter dated 1852, written by Reverend Jonathan Pierce of the local Baptist church, mentions a conversation where he attempted to counsel Margaret about the impropriety of raising a male slave child within her private quarters without proper supervision. Margaret's response, documented in the Reverend's personal diary found in a seminary archive in Jackson, was chilling in its directness. "That boy is mine by law, Reverend. The law grants me complete authority over my property. If you find this troubling, I suggest you petition the legislature, not my conscience." The Reverend never visited Whitmore Plantation again. His diary entries from subsequent years contain only vague references to the Whitmore situation and Matters best left to providence and time. During those formative years, Thomas lived in a reality that defied every norm of plantation life. While other enslaved children his age worked from sunrise to sunset in the cotton fields, learning to pick, plant, and endure, Thomas spent his days in the big house learning to read and write. Sarah, the kitchen worker, later testified in a deposition taken after the Civil War that she once saw Margaret teaching Thomas from the same primers used by white children in the county school. It wasn't right, Sarah stated in the 1867 testimony. Teaching a slave boy to read was against the law, but nobody said nothing because Miss Margaret owned that plantation outright, and nobody wanted to cross her. The isolation intensified as Thomas entered puberty. Margaret ordered that a larger room be prepared for him on the second floor of the big house, directly adjacent to her own chambers. Samuel Briggs, the overseer, expressed his concerns in a letter to his brother in Alabama, discovered in 2023 in a private collection. The boy sleeps 20 feet from her bedroom. He takes his meals at a small table in her sitting room. He wears clothes ordered from New Orleans catalogs, not the slave clothes we distribute. Something ain't natural about this whole arrangement. But when I tried to speak up, she threatened to dismiss me without references. Other enslaved people on the property began to notice changes in Thomas as he grew older. He walked differently than other young men in the quarters, his posture straighter, his speech patterns mimicking Margaret's formal diction. When he occasionally appeared in the kitchen or hallways, he seemed uncomfortable, as if caught between two worlds and belonging to neither. An oral history interview conducted in 1935 with Jeremiah Thompson, whose grandmother had been enslaved at Whitmore Plantation, captured this tension. My grandma said that boy Thomas was like a ghost. He looked like them but lived like white folk. Miss Margaret kept him locked away like some kind of treasure she didn't want nobody else to see. By 1856, when Thomas was 15, whispers in the county had evolved into open speculation. Women at church socials discussed Margaret's unseemly attachment to the albino boy. Men at the county courthouse steps debated whether intervention was necessary, but the legal reality was inescapable. Under Mississippi law, Margaret Whitmore had absolute authority over her enslaved property. No law prevented her from keeping Thomas in the big house. No statute required her to justify her decisions. The system that enslaved millions also created a shield of impenetrable legal protection around plantation owners who chose to exercise their power in disturbing ways. A particularly revealing document came to light in 2019 when researchers at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History uncovered a complaint filed with the county sheriff in 1857. 3 neighboring plantation owners signed a petition expressing moral concern regarding the domestic arrangements at Whitmore Plantation. The complaint described Thomas as being raised in a manner inconsistent with his station, and suggested that Margaret's behavior set a dangerous precedent that undermines the natural order. The sheriff's response, handwritten at the bottom of the petition, was brief and final. No violation of law observed. Matter dismissed. What the official records couldn't capture was the psychological toll on Thomas himself. Letters he wrote decades later, after emancipation, reveal glimpses of those years. In an 1879 letter to a Freedmen's Aid Society in Philadelphia, Thomas described his adolescence as a prison without bars, where kindness and control were so intertwined, I couldn't distinguish one from the other. He wrote of being dressed in fine clothes but forbidden to leave the property, of being taught to read but punished if he attempted to communicate with other enslaved people, of being called by Margaret my special one, while knowing he had no legal personhood, no rights, no future beyond what she decided. The psychological manipulation went deeper than physical confinement. Margaret created a dependency that was emotional as much as legal. She would alternate between maternal affection and cold withdrawal, between gifts and isolation. Thomas described in his letters how she would praise his intelligence one day and remind him of his defective nature the next. She told him repeatedly that no one else would ever care for him, that his albinism made him unemployable, unmarketable, worthless to anyone but her. She made me believe I was lucky to be her property, Thomas wrote in 1880. That was perhaps her greatest cruelty, making me grateful for my own captivity. As Thomas approached his 17th birthday in 1858, the nature of Margaret's control began to shift in ways that would only become clear decades later. Testimony from Sarah, given to a Northern journalist in 1868, hinted at changes in the household dynamic. Miss Margaret started having Thomas dress in formal clothes every evening. She had him sit with her in the parlor while she played piano, She talked about him like he was going to be something special, something nobody would expect. We didn't understand what she meant then. Lord help us. We understand now. The transformation of Thomas from a frightened 7-year-old child into a young man trapped in Margaret's web of control took place entirely within the walls of that big house, witnessed by enslaved workers who were powerless to intervene and neighbors who chose not to see. The silence that surrounded Thomas's growing-up years wasn't just passive, it was active, deliberate, enforced by a legal system that valued property rights over human dignity. And as Thomas turned 18 in 1859, that silence would deepen further, concealing preparations for something that would shock even those who thought they knew the full extent of Margaret Whitmore's obsession. Chapter 3. The preparation. Between 1859 and 1860, subtle changes at Whitmore Plantation signaled something unprecedented was approaching, though few understood what they were witnessing. Margaret Whitmore, now 50 years old, began ordering unusual items from merchants in Natchez and New Orleans. Formal suits tailored for a young man of 20 inches in height, silverware settings for 2, imported fabrics for curtains and linens that far exceeded the practical needs of a plantation household. Samuel Briggs documented these purchases in the plantation ledgers, noting in margins that the mistress seems to be preparing for some significant event, though she has shared no details with staff. Thomas, now 18 years old, found his isolation intensifying rather than loosening as he reached adulthood. Other enslaved men his age were assigned to field crews or skilled labor positions, carpentry, blacksmithing, cooperage, but Thomas remained confined to the big house, his daily routine now including hours of what Margaret called refinement lessons. Sarah observed through kitchen windows as Margaret instructed Thomas on formal dining etiquette, proper posture, and conversational protocols that would be appropriate for a white gentleman, not an enslaved person. It was like she was molding him into something, Sarah later testified, like she had a plan for him that none of us could figure out. The psychological control Margaret had established over Thomas during his childhood had calcified into something more insidious by this point. Letters Thomas wrote after emancipation describe how completely his identity had been shaped by Margaret's influence. "I knew no other life," he wrote in 1881. "I had no memory of my mother, no knowledge of where I came from before that auction. Miss Margaret was my entire world. She controlled what I read, what I thought, how I understood myself. By the time I was 18, I couldn't imagine existence separate from her." Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. In spring of 1860, Margaret made a shocking announcement to Samuel Briggs and the household staff. She would be traveling to Natchez for extended meetings with lawyers and would be taking Thomas with her. This was the first time Thomas would leave the plantation property since his arrival 12 years earlier. The journey itself was laden with uncomfortable tensions. Margaret insisted that Thomas ride inside the carriage beside her, not on the driver's bench where enslaved coachmen typically sat. When they stopped at an inn overnight, she registered him not in the slave quarters, but in an adjacent room to her own, causing visible consternation among the inn staff. The purpose of Margaret's trip to Natchez became clearer through documents later discovered in the files of attorney Cornelius Hampton. Margaret was consulting with lawyers about the legal mechanisms available for manumission, the formal freeing of an enslaved person. But her questions went beyond standard freedom papers. According to notes in Hampton's case files found in 2021 in the Louisiana State Archives, the files had been moved during Reconstruction. Margaret inquired specifically about the legal status of a freed person entering into matrimonial contract with a white citizen, and what documentation would be required to legitimize such an arrangement. Attorney Hampton's notes reveal his discomfort with these questions. In a memo to his partner, he wrote, "Mrs. Whitmore's inquiries suggest an intention that would be socially catastrophic and possibly legally dubious. I have advised her that while Mississippi law does not explicitly prohibit marriage between a freed black person and a white person, such a union would violate every social norm and would likely face violent community resistance." She seemed undeterred by this counsel. What makes these documents particularly disturbing is what they reveal about Margaret's long-term planning. She hadn't purchased Thomas on impulse in 1848. The isolation, the education, the refinement training, all of it had been building toward this moment. She had spent 12 years molding Thomas into someone who could occupy a space between enslaved and free, someone whose albinism and isolation from black community and culture made him appear racially ambiguous to outsiders who didn't know his legal status. Thomas himself seemed to have no clear understanding of what was being planned. In his later writings, he described this period as one of increasing confusion and dread. Miss Margaret spoke of my future in vague terms that both excited and terrified me. She said I would be something special, that she would elevate me beyond my circumstances. I didn't understand then that what she called elevation was actually another form of possession, one that would bind me to her even more completely than legal slavery had. Back at Whitmore Plantation in summer of 1860, preparations intensified. Margaret commissioned a local carpenter to build new furniture for the big house, a large bed frame, matching wardrobes, chairs upholstered in expensive fabric. Neighbors who visited noted the changes and asked tentative questions. Margaret's responses were deliberately cryptic. "I'm making arrangements for my future comfort," was her standard reply. The ambiguity was intentional. She was preparing the community for a revelation without explicitly stating what was coming. The psychological manipulation of Thomas reached its peak during this period. Margaret would oscillate between promising him freedom and reminding him of his dependence on her. She told him that his albinism meant he could never survive in the world of freed black people, that he would be rejected by both black and white communities, that only she saw value in him. She framed what was coming not as her desire, but as the only viable path for his survival. "She convinced me that I needed this," Thomas wrote in 1882, "that without her plan, I would die alone and worthless. She made me believe I should be grateful." Court records from Wilkinson County show that on November 3, 1860, Margaret Whitmore filed manumission papers for Thomas, officially freeing him from slavery. The timing was significant. The presidential election was days away. Sectional tensions were exploding, and many Southerners were already discussing secession. In this moment of regional chaos, Margaret's administrative act drew less attention than it might have otherwise. The manumission papers described Thomas as a faithful servant of good character, freed in recognition of loyal service, standard language that concealed the true nature of their relationship. What happened in the weeks following Thomas's legal emancipation would remain hidden from public view for over 150 years. Sarah and other household workers knew something had fundamentally changed, but the details were kept behind closed doors. All they could observe was that Thomas, now legally free, didn't leave the plantation. He remained in the big house, still isolated, still under Margaret's control. The only visible difference was that he now wore a signet ring on his left hand, a gold band that Margaret had ordered from a New Orleans jeweler, engraved with initials that intertwined M and T in an ornate design that looked disturbingly like a wedding pattern. The silence that had protected Margaret Whitmore's obsession for 12 years would now deepen into something even more impenetrable. What was about to happen would force the community to confront a reality that the law technically allowed but social convention found abhorrent. And the preparation period, those months of furniture, legal documents, and psychological manipulation, would be remembered by witnesses as the calm before a storm that would shatter any remaining illusions about the nature of slavery and the power it granted to those who owned other human beings. Chapter 4. The Wedding That Wasn't Supposed to Exist. On January 14, 1861, 3 months before Confederate forces would fire on Fort Sumter and plunge the nation into civil war, a ceremony took place at Whitmore Plantation that violated every social norm of Mississippi society, while remaining technically within the boundaries of law. Margaret Whitmore, age 52, and Thomas, age 20 and legally freed 3 months earlier, were joined in matrimonial contract by Reverend Amos Whitfield, a circuit-riding Baptist preacher who had arrived from Arkansas only days before and would disappear from county records immediately afterward. The ceremony itself was documented in only one place: a marriage certificate filed in the Wilkinson County Clerk's office, signed by Reverend Whitfield, and witnessed by Samuel Briggs and Sarah, both of whom were coerced into participation under threat of dismissal. The certificate, rediscovered in 2019 during a digitization project of antebellum records, uses carefully crafted language that obscures as much as it reveals. Thomas is listed as Thomas Whitmore, free man of color, with no mention of his previous enslaved status. Margaret is listed with her full legal name and property holdings. The document makes no reference to his albinism, his origins, or the 12 years he spent as her property. The photograph that would later shock historians and descendants was taken on the same day as the ceremony. In 1861, photography was expensive and rare outside of major cities, but Margaret had arranged for a traveling photographer from New Orleans to visit the plantation specifically for this purpose. The image captures Margaret and Thomas standing side by side in the parlor of the big house, both dressed in formal attire. Margaret wears a dark silk dress with lace collar, her substantial figure filling the frame. Thomas, pale and gaunt, wears a tailored suit that hangs loosely on his thin frame. His red eyes stare directly at the camera with an expression that viewers a century and a half later would describe as haunted, resigned, and terrified. What makes the photograph particularly disturbing is what it doesn't show. There are no other people in the frame, no family members celebrating, no guests witnessing, no community gathering. The emptiness surrounding the couple speaks to the isolation Margaret had constructed around Thomas, and the secrecy she maintained about an arrangement that, while technically legal after his manumission, was socially catastrophic. The photographer, whose name appears in Margaret's account books as J. Devereaux Portraiture, was paid $50 in cash, an enormous sum equivalent to 6 months of wages for a skilled worker, and left the same day he arrived. Sarah's testimony, given to a Freedmen's Bureau agent in 1866, provides the only detailed account of that day from someone who was present. Miss Margaret had me dress Thomas in his wedding clothes that morning. He was shaking so bad I could barely button his shirt. He kept asking me if he had to go through with it. I told him I didn't know, that I couldn't advise him, that he was free now and had to make his own choices. But we both knew that wasn't true. He wasn't free. The paper said he was free, but Miss Margaret still owned him in every way that mattered. The ceremony itself lasted less than 10 minutes. Reverend Whitfield read from a standard Protestant liturgy, his voice shaking slightly as he spoke the words that would bind Margaret and Thomas in legal matrimony. Samuel Briggs later testified that the Reverend looked like a man being forced to participate in something he knew was wrong but couldn't refuse. When the ceremony concluded, Margaret kissed Thomas on the cheek. Witnesses described it as proprietorial rather than affectionate. Thomas signed the marriage certificate with the writing skills Margaret had taught him over 12 years. His signature was neat, practiced, and according to Sarah, looked like the handwriting of a man signing his own death warrant. The immediate aftermath of the wedding reveals how completely Margaret had orchestrated the entire situation. She made no public announcement of the marriage. No reception was held. No neighbors were informed. The marriage certificate was filed quietly at the county clerk's office on a day when the clerk was dealing with multiple urgent matters related to secession debates and likely didn't examine the document carefully. Margaret's strategy was to create a legal reality while maintaining enough secrecy that direct confrontation could be avoided. But secrets of that magnitude couldn't remain completely hidden. Within weeks, rumors began circulating in Wilkinson County. The story passed through church socials, courthouse steps, and slave quarter meetings, each telling slightly different but all recognizing that something deeply transgressive had occurred at Whitmore Plantation. The reactions reveal the complex racial and social dynamics of the moment. Some white neighbors expressed outrage that Margaret had degraded herself by marrying someone of African descent, even one who was legally free and visibly white-appearing due to albinism. Others focused on the power dynamics, recognizing that a former slaveholder marrying someone she had owned represented an abuse of authority that made a mockery of both marriage and emancipation. The enslaved and free black community's response was more complex. Some saw Thomas as a victim, recognizing that his entire life had been controlled by Margaret and that the marriage was simply another form of that control. Others felt betrayed, viewing his complicity, however coerced, as a rejection of racial solidarity. An oral history from 1938 captures this tension. Harriet Mason, whose mother had been enslaved at a neighboring plantation, recalled, "My mama said folks didn't know what to think about Thomas. He looked white, lived white, and now was married white. But everybody knew he'd been a slave boy, and everybody knew this wasn't right. It was like Miss Margaret had found a way to own him even more completely by making him her husband." Thomas's own perspective on the wedding day comes from letters he wrote decades later. In an 1885 letter to a correspondent in Boston, he described the ceremony as, "The day I fully understood that freedom was not simply a legal status, but a condition of mind and soul that I had never been allowed to develop." He wrote of standing beside Margaret, speaking vows he had been coached to deliver, feeling the weight of 12 years of manipulation culminating in a moment that legally bound him to his former owner in the most intimate possible way. The timing of the wedding, January 1861, proved significant in ways Margaret likely didn't anticipate. Within months, Mississippi would secede from the Union. Within a year, the Civil War would transform the entire social and legal landscape of the South. The marriage that Margaret had spent years planning and executing would exist in a liminal space, legally recognized in the chaotic final months of the antebellum period, but immediately complicated by war, emancipation, and social upheaval. The photograph she commissioned as proof of her triumph would become instead an artifact of a crime that society had no language to prosecute, but could never quite forget. As 1861 progressed, and war came to Mississippi, the wedding at Whitmore Plantation faded into immediate memory, overshadowed by larger events. But the people who had witnessed it, Sarah, Samuel Briggs, the other enslaved workers who had watched Thomas grow up in captivity, carried the knowledge of what had happened. That knowledge would be passed down through families, whispered in stories, transformed into warnings about power and control. And the photograph, carefully preserved in Margaret's personal Bible, would wait over 150 years to emerge as evidence of a truth that everyone had known but no one had been able or willing to stop. Chapter 5. Life as Property Wife. The period between the wedding in January 1861 and the end of the Civil War in 1865 represents the darkest chapter in Thomas's life, a time when his legal status and actual condition existed in complete contradiction. On paper, he was a free man and a lawful husband. In reality, he remained a prisoner of the woman who had owned him since childhood, now bound to her through matrimonial contract in ways that made escape even more impossible than slavery had. Margaret's behavior after the wedding revealed the true nature of her obsession. She began referring to Thomas publicly as "my husband" to the few neighbors who still visited, watching their reactions with a strange satisfaction. When visitors expressed shock or disapproval, Margaret would produce the marriage certificate and manumission papers, using legal documentation as a shield against social condemnation. "He is free and I am his wife by law," she would say, her voice carrying a challenge. "If you find this objectionable, your quarrel is with Mississippi law, not with me." The domestic arrangements at Whitmore Plantation during this period were documented in fragmentary ways through letters and testimonies. Thomas now shared Margaret's bedroom, a fact that Sarah disclosed with visible distress in her 1866 testimony. "She made him sleep in her bed like a real husband," Sarah stated, "but it wasn't like a marriage. It was like she owned him in a new way. She could call it marriage, but we all knew what it really was." The euphemistic language in Sarah's testimony, required by the social conventions of discussing such matters, barely conceals the reality that Thomas was subjected to sustained, intimate abuse by the woman who had controlled every aspect of his existence since age 7. The Civil War's arrival in Mississippi in 1862 temporarily disrupted life at Whitmore Plantation, but didn't fundamentally alter Thomas's captivity. When Union forces began advancing through the region, Margaret moved with Thomas further inland to a smaller property she owned in the interior of the state. Other enslaved people on Whitmore Plantation began escaping to Union lines, joining the thousands of freedom seekers who fled to federal camps. But Thomas didn't run. In letters written decades later, he explained why. "I had no community to flee to. I knew no other black people beyond the plantation. Miss Margaret had isolated me so completely that I couldn't imagine who I would be or where I would go. She had succeeded in making me dependent not just materially, but psychologically." The psychological control Margaret maintained over Thomas went beyond isolation. She had spent years convincing him that his albinism made him unemployable, that other black people would reject him, that white society would never accept him, that she was the only person who would ever value him. This form of psychological captivity, where the prisoner internalizes the captor's narrative and cannot imagine freedom, has been documented in other extreme cases of long-term abuse. Thomas was living in what modern psychology would recognize as a trauma bond, where years of manipulation had created pathological attachment to his abuser. Documents from 1863 show Margaret attempting to formalize Thomas's position in ways that went beyond the marriage certificate. She drafted a will leaving her entire estate to "my beloved husband Thomas Whitmore," naming him as sole beneficiary. She filed papers at the county courthouse, registering him as co-owner of the plantation property. These legal maneuvers served two purposes. They created a paper trail establishing Thomas as her legitimate spouse, and they further entrapped him by making his financial survival dependent on maintaining the marriage. If he fled, he would forfeit any claim to property or inheritance. Margaret was using the law to construct a cage that looked like legitimacy. Life in the household during the war years was marked by increasing isolation and paranoia, with most enslaved people having fled and Union forces occasionally passing through the region. Margaret grew more possessive of Thomas. Sarah, who remained at the property until 1864 before escaping to Union lines, described Margaret's behavior as wild with jealousy. If Thomas spoke to any other person, enslaved or free, Margaret would rage at him for hours. She monitored his every movement, required him to account for every minute spent outside her presence, and punished perceived disloyalty with days of cold silence or verbal abuse that reduced him to tears. The few people who encountered Thomas during this period left disturbing descriptions. A Union officer who requisitioned supplies from the plantation in 1864 wrote in his diary about meeting a pale man of indeterminate race who appeared to be the mistress's husband, though the relationship seemed highly irregular. The man barely spoke and kept his eyes downcast like a person accustomed to subordination. Another account from a neighboring plantation owner's daughter described seeing Thomas in town accompanying Margaret on errands. He walked 3 steps behind her like a servant, not beside her like a husband. When she spoke to him, he flinched. The end of the Civil War in 1865 and the ratification of the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery should have liberated Thomas completely. Legally, he had been free since 1860. But emancipation for the formerly enslaved didn't extend to someone already trapped in Margaret's matrimonial snare. While thousands of freed people were beginning new lives, reuniting with families and building communities, Thomas remained at Whitmore Plantation, still isolated, still under Margaret's control, still legally bound to her through marriage vows that he had never freely chosen. The immediate post-war years brought new complications. Freedmen's Bureau agents visited Whitmore Plantation in 1866 to register formerly enslaved people and investigate labor conditions. When they interviewed Thomas, Margaret was present, answering questions on his behalf. The agents noted in their report that the relationship appears unusual but is supported by legal documentation of both manumission and marriage. They didn't probe further, missing or ignoring signs that would have been obvious to observers not constrained by the legal paperwork Margaret had so carefully constructed. Sarah, who had escaped to Union lines and was interviewed separately by Freedmen's agents, tried to explain Thomas's situation, but her testimony was vague, constrained by the difficulty of describing abuse that happened within legal marriage. "She owns him even though he's free," Sarah said. "I don't know how to explain it better than that. The paper says one thing, but the truth is different." The agents noted her concerns but took no action. Without specific allegations of physical violence and with legal marriage documentation on file, they had no grounds for intervention. Thomas himself made one documented attempt to leave during this period. In spring of 1867, he walked away from the plantation while Margaret was away visiting family. He made it 20 miles to the town of Woodville before turning back. In a letter written in 1888, Thomas explained his return. "I realized I had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. I had no family, no community, no skills beyond what Miss Margaret had taught me. I was 26 years old but had the life experience of a child. I returned because I didn't know how to exist without her, even though I hated her. That's what 2 decades of captivity had done to me." The years between 1867 and 1875, when Margaret died, represented Thomas's longest continuous period of captivity through marriage. He was legally free, legally married, and legally entitled to inherit property, but he was not free in any meaningful sense. Margaret's control over him was total, maintained not through chains but through psychological manipulation, social isolation, and the perverse legitimacy that legal marriage provided to what was fundamentally an abusive captivity relationship. And during all those years, the wedding photograph sat in Margaret's Bible, physical proof of a crime that looked like legality, waiting for a future when people might finally understand what they were seeing. Chapter 6. The Widow's Inheritance. If this story has already gripped you, leave a like. It helps the story of Thomas and Margaret Whitmore reach more people. When Margaret Whitmore died in November 1875 at age 66, Thomas was 34 years old and had spent 27 years under her control, first as her property, then as her husband. Her death should have represented liberation, but instead it opened a new chapter of suffering, this time inflicted by a community that had watched the entire situation unfold and had chosen silence over intervention. The will Margaret left behind was simultaneously generous and vindictive, calculated to bind Thomas even after her death. The will filed in Wilkinson County Probate Court in December 1875 named Thomas as sole heir to Whitmore Plantation and all associated property, livestock, and financial assets. On paper, this made Thomas a wealthy man. The plantation, though diminished by war and Reconstruction, was still worth approximately $15,000, a substantial sum. But Margaret had included provisions that revealed her control extended beyond the grave. The property could not be sold for 10 years. Thomas was required to continue living on the plantation and maintain it in a manner befitting the Whitmore family legacy. If he violated these conditions, the property would pass to Margaret's distant cousins in Virginia. Thomas found himself trapped in an impossible situation. He inherited wealth but not freedom. The plantation required management, maintenance, and labor he had no experience organizing. Margaret had isolated him so completely from practical knowledge of plantation management that he was dependent on Samuel Briggs, the overseer, who had his own resentments and ambitions. The formerly enslaved people who had worked at Whitmore Plantation during slavery had long since left, seeking new lives elsewhere. Thomas was alone on a property that felt more like a tomb than an inheritance. The community's response to Thomas's new status revealed the deep racism and social hostility that had been building for years. White neighbors who had tolerated the marriage with Margaret because of her social position and property ownership now viewed Thomas as an illegitimate heir who had no right to own white-occupied land. A petition circulated in 1876 calling for legal investigation of the questionable circumstances surrounding Thomas Whitmore's acquisition of valuable property. The petition, signed by 17 white men, alleged that Thomas had exerted undue influence over a mentally incompetent widow, an absurd claim given that Margaret had been the one exercising control throughout the relationship. The petition went nowhere legally, but it signaled social hostility that made Thomas's life increasingly unbearable. Merchants in town refused to extend him credit. The Baptist church where Margaret had occasionally attended declined to allow Thomas to join as a member. When he attempted to hire workers to help maintain the plantation, freed black workers refused, viewing him as someone who had benefited from proximity to whiteness and slavery's power structure. White workers wouldn't work for a man they considered racially black, regardless of his appearance. Thomas was isolated economically, socially, and racially. Financial difficulties compounded his isolation. Thomas had no experience managing money or running a business. Margaret had controlled all finances during their marriage, making every decision, handling every transaction. Now responsible for property taxes, maintenance costs, and his own survival, Thomas struggled. Samuel Briggs, recognizing Thomas's vulnerability, began embezzling funds and selling plantation assets for personal profit. When Thomas discovered the theft in 1877, Briggs simply left, taking significant money and property with him. Thomas had no legal recourse. Reporting the theft would require going to white authorities, who had made clear their hostility toward him. The psychological toll of this period was severe. Thomas began drinking heavily, seeking numbness from the isolation and grief. Letters he wrote to a missionary organization in Philadelphia in 1878 revealed deep despair. "I am wealthy in paper and destitute in spirit. I own land but belong nowhere. I am called free but remain imprisoned by a past I cannot escape." The missionary organization sent one response encouraging him to join a church, but offered no practical assistance. Thomas was alone with trauma that he had no language or framework to process. In 1879, facing mounting debts and deteriorating mental health, Thomas made a decision that suggests how completely Margaret's manipulation had defined his understanding of himself. He attempted to donate Whitmore Plantation to the Baptist Church, essentially giving away his inheritance in exchange for the church's agreement to allow him to live in a small cabin on the property as a caretaker. The church initially accepted, seeing an opportunity to acquire valuable property. But when news of the arrangement spread, community backlash was immediate. Church elders received threats. Members threatened to leave the congregation. Within 2 weeks, the church reversed its decision, returning the property to Thomas and asking him to never return. The incident broke something fundamental in Thomas. In letters written in 1880, he described feeling completely erased as a person. He was too black for white society, too marked by association with slavery and Margaret for black community acceptance, too traumatized and isolated to build new identity or relationships. The inheritance that should have provided security instead anchored him to a place and past that offered only continued suffering. He was wealthy and homeless, free and imprisoned, visible and completely unseen. In 1881, Thomas made one final attempt at escape. He advertised the plantation for sale in New Orleans newspapers, offering it at a price well below market value. A buyer emerged, a northern investor interested in Mississippi land. The sale was nearly complete when Margaret's Virginia cousins, who had been monitoring the situation, filed a lawsuit claiming the will's 10-year prohibition on sale was still in effect. The lawsuit dragged through courts for 2 years, depleting Thomas's remaining resources and forcing him to borrow money at predatory interest rates. Eventually, the case was dismissed on technical grounds, but by then the buyer had lost interest, and Thomas was deeply in debt. The period between 1881 and 1885, when Thomas finally abandoned the plantation, represented his lowest point. He lived alone in the big house where he had spent his childhood in forced marriage, surrounded by memories and ghosts. Neighbors reported seeing him walking the property at night, talking to himself. The house deteriorated around him. Windows broke and went unrepaired. The roof leaked. The gardens overgrew into wilderness. Thomas seemed to be dissolving along with the property, becoming less substantial as the years passed. One documented incident from this period captures Thomas's state of mind. In 1884, a traveling preacher stopped at the plantation seeking directions. He found Thomas in the parlor, sitting in Margaret's old chair, the wedding photograph in his hands. He was crying, the preacher wrote in his diary. He said he was trying to understand what his life meant, whether he had ever been a real person or just something Margaret had created. He asked me if a slave could become free if he never learned to think of himself as anything but property. I had no answer for him. When Thomas finally walked away from Whitmore Plantation in 1885, he left everything behind: the property, the furniture, the documents, and the wedding photograph that would resurface 134 years later. He had spent 44 years as Margaret's property, husband, and heir. He walked away with nothing but trauma, no community, no family, and no clear path forward. The inheritance that should have compensated him for decades of suffering instead became another form of captivity, proof that Margaret's control extended beyond death, beyond law, into the darkest corners of Thomas's broken psyche. Chapter 7. The Disappearance. In March 1885, Thomas Whitmore left Whitmore Plantation for the last time and vanished from official records. For 140 years, historians assumed he had died shortly after abandoning the property, perhaps succumbing to the alcoholism and despair that had marked his final years in Mississippi. But documents discovered in 2022 in the archives of a Philadelphia Freedmen's Aid Society revealed a different and even more tragic story. Thomas survived for another 36 years, living under assumed names, working transient labor, and carrying the psychological wounds of his captivity until his death in 1921 at age 80. The first trace of Thomas after his disappearance appears in a letter dated July 1885, sent to the Pennsylvania Freedmen's Relief Association from Memphis, Tennessee. The letter, signed T. Wilson, describes the writer as a freed man seeking guidance on establishing new identity after years in difficult circumstances. The handwriting matches samples of Thomas's writing from the 1870s. The letter asks specific questions about changing legal names, obtaining new documentation, and finding communities that might accept someone with an unusual history. The association's response, found in the same archive, offered basic advice but no substantive assistance. Thomas spent the next several years moving between cities across the South and border states: Memphis, Louisville, St. Louis, Cincinnati. Employment records from riverboat companies show a Thomas Wilson working as a steward on Mississippi River vessels between 1886 and 1889. Fellow workers described him in payroll notes as quiet, keeps to himself, reliable but odd. His albinism made him recognizable, but also provided a kind of protective anonymity. People noticed his appearance but didn't connect him to the scandalous Whitmore marriage that had occurred decades earlier in Mississippi. In 1890, a census enumerator in Cincinnati recorded a Thomas Wilson, white, age 49 laborer, living in a boarding house near the riverfront. The racial designation white appears to have been based on Thomas's appearance rather than his actual ancestry. This census record represents a complex moment in Thomas's life. He was passing as white, perhaps out of necessity for employment and housing, but doing so isolated him further from any potential black community or support system. He existed in a racial limbo, claiming an identity that wasn't fully true while hiding an identity he had never been allowed to fully develop. Letters Thomas wrote during the 1890s, discovered in 2023 in a collection of papers donated to Howard University, reveal his ongoing psychological struggle. Writing to various aid organizations and religious groups, he described his past in veiled terms, seeking help for trauma he couldn't directly name. "I spent my youth in circumstances of profound control," he wrote in 1893. "I was owned in ways that went beyond the legal definition of slavery. I am seeking guidance on how a person recovers themselves after decades of having no self." Most organizations never responded. Those that did offered religious platitudes but no practical assistance for the kind of complex trauma Thomas was describing. In 1895, at age 54, Thomas attempted something remarkable. He enrolled in a night school literacy program in Indianapolis, despite already knowing how to read and write. A teacher's diary from that program, found in the Indianapolis Public Library archives, mentions an older student who seemed to be trying to learn himself anew, as if he had spent his life reading someone else's words and wanted to discover his own. Thomas attended for 6 months before disappearing again, leaving no forwarding information. The most detailed documentation of Thomas's later life comes from his time in Philadelphia between 1898 and 1915. He worked as a custodian at a Presbyterian church, living in a small room in the church basement. The pastor, Reverend Arthur McManus, kept detailed records of conversations with Brother Thomas, as he was known to the congregation. These records, discovered in 2020 in Philadelphia Seminary archives, provide the most complete picture of Thomas's mental state in his later years. According to McManus's notes, Thomas suffered from severe nightmares and what modern psychology would recognize as complex PTSD. He would wake screaming Margaret's name. He compulsively cleaned his room, arranging and rearranging his few possessions, unable to tolerate disorder or mess, behaviors that suggested ongoing anxiety from years of being controlled. He was terrified of intimacy, refusing any social contact beyond what was necessary for work. When women from the church attempted to include him in social activities, he would panic and hide in his room for days. McManus's most revealing observation came in a journal entry from 1902. "Brother Thomas carries a burden I cannot fully comprehend. He speaks of having been owned, body and soul, by a woman who he both feared and, in some twisted way, felt gratitude toward. He says she taught him to read but stole his ability to think. He says she gave him a home but destroyed his capacity to feel at home anywhere. He is a man divided against himself, unable to integrate the fragments of his identity into any coherent whole." During his Philadelphia years, Thomas made one attempt to tell his full story. In 1905, he wrote a lengthy autobiographical letter to the editor of the Colored American magazine, detailing his life from the 1848 auction through his forced marriage and years as Margaret's husband prisoner. The letter was extraordinary in its honesty, describing the sexual abuse, psychological manipulation, and continued trauma in explicit terms rare for that era. The magazine never published it. The editor's rejection letter, found with Thomas's original manuscript in the magazine's archives, called the story too disturbing for our readership and frankly difficult to believe. The letter survives as one of the few first-person accounts of sustained slavery-related sexual abuse written by a male survivor. In 1915, Thomas's health began failing. Church records show he developed respiratory problems, likely tuberculosis. He continued working as long as he could, but by 1918 he was bedridden in his basement room. Reverend McManus arranged for him to be moved to a charity hospital where he spent his final 3 years. Hospital records describe him as confused at times, often calling out for someone named Margaret, other times cursing that name. He had no visitors except the Reverend, who came weekly until Thomas's death on February 17, 1921. Thomas died intestate, with no known heirs or family. He was buried in a pauper's section of a Philadelphia cemetery, under the name Thomas Wilson. The grave was unmarked. Reverend McManus conducted a brief funeral service attended by 3 people. In his sermon notes preserved in seminary archives, McManus wrote, "We laid to rest today a man whose life was stolen from him twice, once by slavery, and once by a woman who should have been his liberator, but became his most complete captor. May he finally find the freedom that eluded him in life." The burial records list Thomas's age as 80, his occupation as laborer, and his place of birth as unknown. Every detail was either wrong or incomplete, a final erasure of a man who had spent 80 years being defined by others, controlled by others, misunderstood by others. The only personal effect found in his room was a small leather journal containing fragments of writing, memories, observations, attempts at poetry. One entry, dated 1919, reads, "I am an old man who was never allowed to be a child, a free man who never escaped captivity, a husband who was never anything but property. I do not know who I was meant to be, only what I was forced to become." For over a century, Thomas Wilson's grave remained unmarked and his story unknown. The few people who had known fragments of his past were long dead. Whitmore Plantation fell into ruin, was eventually sold for taxes, and was demolished in the 1950s. The wedding photograph that would eventually reveal the truth sat forgotten in a church attic. Thomas had vanished as completely in death as he had tried to in life. Another erased victim of slavery's long shadow. Another story buried beneath silence and shame. Only the accidental discovery of archived documents would finally give voice to what he had suffered and reveal the full extent of a tragedy that spanned 8 decades.